I've just come out of the Sarah Lucas show at Tate Britain. She has such a raw and confrontational aesthetic, and she's working with such everyday materials, almost throwaway materials, cigarettes, food, old furniture, particularly chairs. There's something really repulsive about the work. It's kind of worn out and has a grubby feel to it. It actually evokes a really unpleasant domestic space, like a dirty old flat. I definitely wouldn't want to own any of her work, but it's a really impressive and confrontational aesthetic, and I enjoyed this show very much. Her work is very sexually explicit and provocative, and maybe even at times a little bit gratuitous. There's no subtlety at all in it, and it can feel a little bit heavy-handed, and the metaphors are very obvious. She's been making very similar work for decades, and I think she's never or rarely allowed more poetry to come into the work. The work's always had this kind of real upfront, unapologetic obviousness. The fact that there's never any ambiguity in the metaphors, I think actually sometimes gives it an oversimplified feel, perhaps almost a little bit juvenile. When I first encountered her work, quite a while back now, I did find it very original and creative, but I think the repetition of the very similar conceptual work, the similarities between the work over the decades, I do have a slight problem with. One of the first works, which is an early work from 1999 called Wanker, definitely has quite a lot of potency. It was one of my favorite works in the show. Firstly, it's humorous. The first thing you do when you see this work is smile. The title is so interesting. At one level, it's a factual description of what you're looking at, but it could also be an insult, and I love this ambiguity. The fact that it's made by a woman, so as a man looking at it, it feels like it's a woman addressing men, and it's provocative in a really interesting way. I think that so much can be read into this work. It's perhaps commenting on some form of mechanical male sexual gratification. There's something about the complexity of the machinery. It's a bit over-engineered for what actually is quite a simple task. Also, there's definitely something about the chair. It's not a comfortable chair to masturbate in. There's something about the rigidity and discomfort of it. And the other thing I really like about this work is that there's an implied space here. And I really like space in a work. We can only see a bit of the body and the chair, but the space that the rest of the body kind of fills is there as a sculpture. That space is different than the space surrounding it. And as I said, I don't think her work has a lot of poetry in it, but I do find this a really profound poetic moment. I have seen her work a few times over the years, and I've never really noticed before that there is in many of her sculptures a kind of implied space. This is apparent in another early work in that first room, The Old Couple from 1992. Again, there's a lot of room there for interpretation. It's humorous, it's uncomfortable. There's a penis and false teeth, and it conjures up image of this old couple. I also really liked the blown up tabloid newspaper works. It's such simple materials, these blown up photocopies, and the way they're just kind of put together unapologetically, where you can see the joins. It has such an aesthetic simplicity and a rawness. I really like that. Again, there's humor. There's humor in all of Sarah Lucas's work. I think you could say that's more than poetry. That's the one thing that's in every piece of work. But I think there is a serious commentary here about objectification. I really like the ambiguity. You don't know if she's disgusted by this piece and the objectification implied by it, or a bit of her actually likes it, or probably, I think, both. The work Soju Girls from 1990 is particularly interesting. I think it really illustrates this ambiguity, that kind of pathetic tabloid titillation. It's really highlighting that. But at the same time, there's something here about celebrating that the subject of the main story is unashamedly sexual. There's a sexual freedom that she's found, and kind of a middle finger to morality judgments of women claiming their sexuality. I think this is really impressive. There's a very long room which contains 16 sculptures in the middle of it, and this is a really impressive spectacle. I just love the scale of it. I love scale in works, and it turns into something much more than 16 different sculptures. It becomes something collectively. This is actually the second time I've seen the show, and the first time I saw it, the room was filled with people, but this time it was completely empty, and it's such a different experience seeing it empty than compared to when it was packed. Just me and all these women. It was powerful. That said, all of these works are very recent, and it does feel like there's not really any new ideas here. As I say, it does feel like to some extent she's been doing the same thing many, many times. I do wonder if there's just a bit too much of her doing the same thing for decades. The fact that some of these sculptures are in bronze and concrete and steel, this is quite a jolting change in aesthetic from all of the other work I've seen by her, and not really in a good way. It feels like it kind of commoditizes the work. It makes it more saleable than her previous work has been. From a business perspective, it's really smart, and I wouldn't blame any artist for making their work sellable. But from a poetry perspective, it's a bit of a miss for me, I must say. Overall, I do like her work. It's really interesting, and she has such challenging ideas and good humor in the work. It's simplistic and it is repetitive, especially in a big show like this. You really see the repetitiveness. It's like when the big Picasso show that they had at the Tate Modern. I quite like looking at Picasso works, but room after room of Picasso. I think it's the problem when you get a retrospective. So there is an element of that here. I think I actually prefer to see, one or two Sarah Lucas works in a very small show. And that's probably the same for all artists. That's not a Sarah Lucas issue. One positive thing about the repetition here is that I really noticed how much she uses chairs and seats in her work. And I don't think I'd noticed that before. This is the single most common thread, I think, that runs through the whole show and gives it a coherency. There's quite a lot about smoking and cigarettes consistently in her aesthetic. And how you respond to this, I guess, depends on whether you're a smoker or not. I find this more difficult to read. The car crash with all the cigarettes, it does seem to be extremely literal. The wall-to-ceiling photos that completely cover the walls of the final room feel a bit like, fuck you, I smoke. I can see that there's an attempt to be poetic here with the blurring and the patterns created by the smoke, but I just don't enjoy looking at these images. I also really don't enjoy looking at cigarettes stuffed in vaginas or bottoms. But do you know what? The fact I don't enjoy some of the work, I don't think this is a bad thing. I think this is what Sarah's work does to you. I have the feeling that even if you like her work, if at least a part of you isn't just a bit disgusted by some of her work, then the work hasn't done what she intended. At the end of the exhibition, there's several sofa and fluorescent light sculptures, and a couple of them are actually outside the exhibition. These really felt like a fresh perspective after so many female form sculptures. It's a really good way to end the show. I think there's more ambiguity in those works, especially the one that's in the show with the fluorescent lights through the chair at the end. It has a similarity to her other work, but it does feel like it's developing the ideas in a really interesting way. Sarah Lucas isn't my favourite artist, but I do respect her work, and this is a great retrospective of it. It's definitely unmissable. Thanks for watching. See you next time.